Empires like the Sumerians and the Egyptians did not generally control the daily lives of the thousands of people within their territories, nor were they able to effectively force their cultural norms on the citizens of the diverse city-states within their empires. These areas remained largely self-governing. However, the technology of the wheel and the fact that civilizations developed along rivers meant that communication networks like roads and barge systems linked all of these areas. Trade grew increasingly important, with vast amounts of wealth flowing between cities whose populations became more and more dependent and used to these goods. This allowed rulers like Sargon and the early pharaohs to avoid having to control the interior workings of each city and instead focus on securing the roadways, allowing them to tax the goods flowing through these networks and argue for the payment of tribute from client states in return for securing peace. This increase in control and contact demanded better forms of written communication to keep track of records, transmit laws, and record unifying religious myths. Military technology wasn't the only important knowledge traveling through the Fertile Crescent with trade. Language was also spreading. The earliest forms of language were individual spoken languages, probably hundreds of them, each only shared among small groups of humans living together. The development of settled civilizations led to the need for writing to preserve ownership, retell myths, and identify authority. This earliest writing is called pictography, since each word is designated by a picture. This demanded a large amount of picture words and was only really useful for regional audiences whose conceptions of things like houses or boats were already similar. For example, an Eskimo and a desert dweller would have problems creating an image for boat that was mutually understandable. Pictography is easily read by local people, however. No formal training is necessary because it's just a picture. Yet it is extremely limited because it cannot relate intangible concepts like love or time or prepositions like on, behind, in front of, etc. Because of this, Sumerians developed cuneiform, a conventional sign type of written language. In this style of language, symbols, or signs, have an agreed upon meaning, i.e. it's by convention. And these symbols must be taught to writers in a formal school. You have to know an apostrophe is an apostrophe. Hammurabi's law code was an outgrowth of this process, and only practical at a later period when frequent contact throughout the river valleys of Mesopotamia meant the peoples in the region shared most cultural characteristics. Social control also grew in Egypt during the 2nd millennium BC for the same reason. However, not everyone embraced this increased control by urban governments. When city-states first formed, those who chose to maintain a semi-nomadic pastoralist lifestyle merely moved away. There was lots of space. By the 2nd millennium, though, the increased number of city-states and the web of trade networks, roads, and riverways pushed these peoples in between further away from urban centers. Peoples in between often maintained tribal family power, generally in the hands of the patriarchs or old men. Tribal leaders worked hard to maintain religious and social allegiance among the tribe in order to keep people from leaving for these urban lifestyles. These family leaders stood to lose the most, in fact, all of their status if the tribe integrated with city-states. Yet these people were anything but isolated. Cities needed the meat and animal products that pastoralists produced. The pastoralists quickly developed a taste for the goods and luxuries urban centers offered. Indeed, while they claimed to revere their ancient past, peoples in between were constantly adapting new concepts and technologies into their cultures. One example is the way established trade provided new ways for pastoralists to actually make a living. They started moving trade goods alongside their livestock as they migrated from city to city, working as caravan leaders. Other groups began to live as bandits, preying upon this same trade. Thus, they were involved in the trade networks, but not controlled. One influential group of people in between was the Israelites, a branch of people who spoke the Semitic language known as Hebrew and linked themselves to a common tribal ancestor named Abram. The story of Abram, written down in their religious text called the Torah, describes his tribe practicing just this sort of lifestyle and migrating from southern Mesopotamia to northern Mesopotamia to Egypt and then back again, carrying goods for trade as well as livestock. Abram would eventually dedicate his family to a single God called Yahweh, who he claimed would support his family, his tribe, throughout time. In light of this promise, his name became Abraham. This story would be told and retold for generations to explain why the later Israelites were a special people, different from their neighbors, and why they worshiped only one God. In some ways, the Hittite Empire was the end result of trade and technology. The abundance of iron had made it a target for early metallurgy, but the problem was that iron can only be purified and hardened at temperatures unreachable by an open flame. The Hittites were the first to develop ways to increase the air pressure in a furnace hot enough to reach super hot temps. Iron produced this way was harder than bronze. Products lasted longer, took more abuse, and held an edge. While armor is an obvious use for this technology, the pins, axles, and harnesses associated with chariots were more important. Chariots made with iron were the tanks of the ancient world and would dominate warfare from 1500 BC to 300 BC. In the short run, this technology allowed the Hittites to dominate the Syrian plains. This was the crucial stretch of the trade crescent, linking Mesopotamia with the Palestinian coastline and the road to Egypt. The Hittites taxed this route and maintained a rich empire for about 300 years, roughly 1500 to 1200 BC, until the surrounding regions picked up the technology for themselves and pushed the Hittites back into the mountains. The trade routes that made the Hittite Empire feasible, the ones they were so intent on preserving and controlling, eventually carried iron technology to all the regional peoples that they had conquered, and it gave these people the ability to control their own destinies.